All right, class, hey, welcome. Today, I want to talk to you about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when we start talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, what we're talking about is roughly 13 days in October of 1962 when the Soviet Union decided that they would place nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Now, the reason why, of course, the Soviet Union was looking to do that was that we, the United States, of course, had missiles in Europe, and we had what we referred to as a first strike capability. We could hit them before they could hit us. All right. And so after the revolution in Cuba, in which Fidel Castro comes to power, Castro will ally himself with the Soviet Union, and this gives the Soviet Union an opportunity to potentially put in those nuclear missiles this close to the United States. Now, upon Kennedy's arrival to the presidency, he has a situation in which is kind of an embarrassment to the administration, to the United States, in the failed coup attempt called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, what had happened there is our attempt, once we realized that Castro had allied himself with the Soviet Union, was that we wanted to try to remove Castro. And so we trained some Cuban exiles, and we attempted to then drop them off into Cuba to create a coup and uprising, believing that other Cubans will then come to this this uprising and help to overthrow Castro. And it goes horribly wrong. The Castro regime understands what's happening, they know what's going to go on, and they are prepared and they are ready. And so Kennedy, although he had not been really a part of the plan but had signed off on it, is kind of, again, early on in his first year of presidency, is embarrassed by this failure to remove Castro, which then emboldens the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba. So now in 1962, U-2 spy plane comes over Cuba and takes pictures, and the evidence is clear. Missiles are starting to be constructed in Cuba. And so, of course, this was something the Soviets promised they would not do. We confronted them and we asked them if they were doing this, and of course, they deny it. So, what begins to happen now is that Kennedy is going to kind of have to make a decision. I mean, do we go in with airstrikes and try to take out those missiles? Do we try to negotiate a removal of those missiles? What is the best tactic? Because once they're operational, that really restricts what we're able to do. I mean, if they're operational missiles, we really can't go in militarily because they may launch them. All right, so we have a finite amount of time in which we can try to negotiate something before we might have to just go in militarily and try to remove them, is how the administration is approaching this. And so Kennedy does confront the Soviet Union in this. He gets on national television. He tells the American public that we have evidence that the Soviets are putting missiles in Cuba, and he announces a quarantine, basically a blockade of any Russian ships or Soviet ships coming into Cuba so that no further missiles can be constructed or no new materials can be brought in to construct any more missiles. And so that's kind of the first standoff. And the Soviets, we were not sure what their response was going to be, but of course, in the end, they do turn their ships around. And that's kind of the first kind of chess match piece that kind of transpires there, is that we are able to get them to turn their ships around, but it doesn't really solve the problem of the missiles still in Cuba. And so, how are we going to convince the Soviets to remove those missiles becomes the next piece. And so in the midst of this, again, roughly 2-week period, we confront them in the United Nations as we are attempting to, again, put pressure on the Soviets to get those missiles out. The Soviets are kind of denying the fact that those missiles are there, that it's the United States that is basically lying to the world and bringing the world to this brink, not them. But in the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson confronts the Soviet representative there with pictures and satellite photos, and basically kind of lays it all out there. So it does prove, of course, that the Soviets had done this. But the question then is, well, what are the Soviets going to do? And they're not just going to remove those missiles. Meanwhile, Kennedy has to make a decision. All right, the missiles are becoming more and more closer to operation. what are we going to do if the Soviets continue to kind of hem and haw about their stance on this and act like they might negotiate something while those missiles are becoming operational? How are we going to respond? We do send reconnaissance planes over Cuba. They are shot at. In fact, we do lose a service member as he is shot down trying to get photos, which again just heightens those tensions between us and the Soviets. And when it seemed like we were at our kind of last hour, it was Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, who will go and kind of have one last negotiation. And in the end, what we were able to do is to kind of come up with an agreement that the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba as long as we, the United States, promised a non-invasion pledge of Cuba. All right. Kennedy had always, after the Bay of Pigs, felt like he didn't really want to invade Cuba anyway again. And so that was really not much of a negotiating point for him. He was willing to do that no matter what. Now, there was a caveat to that as well, meaning that the Soviets also wanted us to remove our missiles from Turkey. All right, so something that was close to them, they wanted us to remove those missiles. And we weren't really willing to negotiate that as part of this agreement initially. The idea that it would be a quid pro quo, that if we remove our missiles here, they'll remove their missiles there. Our fear being that they would continue to quid pro quo us down the line until finally, maybe they wanted to take back West Berlin, and they had something that we just wouldn't negotiate at that point. So we weren't really willing to just make that a part of it. But what we did tell them was that we would remove those missiles later. All right, that we would look at removing the missiles out of Turkey 6 months down the line, so that it didn't really appear to be as a kind of a connectivity to the negotiations that were there. So really the deal was, as long as we promised to never invade Cuba, they would remove those missiles. Now, again, that's a very kind of quick overview of the crisis in October of 1962. There were a lot of kind of back channels, and there were some questions about whether a coup had even occurred in Russia during this whole time, and what could we believe, because we thought we had an agreement at one point, and then they rescinded that agreement, and we weren't quite sure where we all stood, and should we get the planes ready. And so a couple things that came out of this that we have now learned since. One is that in the 60s, late 60s, 70s, and then into the 80s, we had kind of a direct communication to the Kremlin at this point. We wanted to make sure that we could have a communication between us and the Soviet premier and not have to go through back channels and be able to negotiate these things without, risking a time frame and accidentally having somebody launch a nuclear weapon. And so the red phone, as it became called, was put into the White House so that we would have that direct connection. We've also learned since that had we gone in militarily and tried to take out those weapons, that by this point the Soviets had actually a couple of operational nuclear missiles, and that the orders were, if we came in militarily, that they were supposed to launch what they could. And so very close to an actual nuclear exchange had Kennedy announced a military option here, that the Soviets may have actually launched a nuclear strike on the United States, which would, in Kennedy's words, he even said, would cause the United States to respond in a similar way. So very high tensions in 1962, very, very close to a nuclear exchange between us and the Soviet Union there, and luckily, of course, that didn't happen. We were able to negotiate to avert that situation and kind of allow for an easing of tensions between us and the Soviets at that point. And so a little bit of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Next time we'll look at the Korea and Vietnam Wars and how they kind of play into the Cold War aspect.